Ladies and gentlemen, my task is extremely simple. I'm Stanley Rosen from the local philosophy department, and it's my pleasure to tell you what you already know, which is what philosophers are supposed to do. And that is that our two speakers will be Professor Daniel Kevles from Yale University, very well known for his writings on science and the history of science, and Professor George Annis from Boston University, who is in the law school and the medical school and School of Public Health. The form, I'm told, is that the speakers will speak not simultaneously, but consecutively. And they'll speak each for 25 minutes, or I'll have to do something. And then we'll have our discussion period. So with that said, I think, would you like to go first?
No.
Fine.
Thank you, Professor Rosen, and thank you to the organizers from the Pardee Conference Center for making it possible for me to be here today. As Professor Rosen told you, I'm a historian, and when I was asked to participate in this quite stimulating conference, I insisted that I don't know anything about the future, and I can hardly lecture about it. And as a result, what I would do would be to speak about the past and try to put contemporary events in some sort of historical perspective. And that's what I propose to do today. But I'm not going to speak very much about the distant past. It's going to be more about the recent past. And some of my remarks, as you will see, have been shaped to a small degree, at least, by what the stimulating talks that I've heard in the course of today. Let me begin by observing what I think you all know, but and that pervades this conference, namely that we are hurtling through a profound revolution in our perception of ourselves, one that has prompted both excitement and rueful apprehension at the same time. This combination of responses and the revolution itself stimulated no one less than President Bill Clinton not too long ago to comment at a White House Millennium Evening on biology and informatics. I quote him, "We don't want people to lose their sense of identity. We don't want them to lose the fragility of their sense of self." This contemporary revolution, which is about genetics and about neuroscience, as I'll say in a bit, is the third such revolution in historical memory. The first, of course, comprised the removal of the Earth from the center of the universe, the transformation of coordinates that eventually placed our planet and us with it on the periphery of one minor galaxy amid billions of others, reaching billions of light years in all directions. The second, Darwin's revolution, destroyed our uniqueness in the realm of living things. It made us another branch of the animal kingdom, compelled to acknowledge that we have, as Thomas Henry Huxley remarked in 1860, a miserable ape for a grandfather. Both the Copernican and the Darwinian revolutions at least left us with the notion that as human animals, we are unique, with high intelligence, a basket of emotions, and the capacities for morality, aesthetics, language, culture, science, with, in short, the capacities that lie at the core of what, for a convenient shorthand, people in general tend to call human nature. My concern today with ideas of human nature is really not the scientific and scholarly concern, at least I don't start from there, that you have heard about so eloquently and incisively so far today. It's with how people in the larger culture think about human nature. Now, I would suggest that even if it's the case that in scholarship and philosophy that notions of human nature have been out of fashion for a century or more, I think that if you had stopped someone randomly on the streets of New York or Boston or Paris or London, wherever, in, say, 1850 and said, "Is there such a thing as human nature?" you would have gotten a positive response. The current revolution challenges that conception of human nature by deconstructing us into constituent biological parts. It may be that these parts sort of determine our notions in a scientific sense, and maybe even in a philosophical one of human nature. But nevertheless, another way of looking at it is that these our conceptions of human nature in the popular sense have been deconstructed, or are being deconstructed. In one regard, this is an old story. For more than a century, we have known that in our bodily structure and functions, not to mention breakdowns and dysfunctions, we are physical and chemical machines. Skeletal mechanics, after all, permits us our bipedality, an opposing thumb our dexterity, and biochemical processes allow us to metabolize the food we eat into the energy required for motion, thought, and expression. But the deconstruction of our day strikes at the essence and autonomy of being human. I want, as I said, to dwell on two developments briefly that lie at the core of this revolution in perception. One is the conglomerate of shifts being worked by the rapid advances in human genetics, including their coupling with the new reproductive technologies. The other comprises the stunning advances in the neurosciences. The biologization of human nature and behavior has fascinated the general public, but it has also fostered among many of its thoughtful members that rueful apprehension that Clinton seemed to sense and a degree of worry and anxiety. Recombinant DNA, the method of genetic manipulation that arrived in the laboratory in the early 1970s, has perhaps more than any other innovation enabled the revolution in human genetics. Recombinant DNA, after all, emancipated human genetics from its burdensome dependence on the analysis of family pedigrees by permitting scientists to isolate individual genes and analyze their function in terms of its DNA coding. Now, the swift mapping and sequencing of the human genome is steadily revealing the code's actual contents, embedded, of course, in an alphabet of molecules for producing the human organism. It is establishing the general blueprint for all of us and laying down procedures for obtaining the specific blueprint for any one of us. It is a blueprint that details instructions, or so it is said popularly, for the construction of each of our essential parts. Perhaps inevitably the rendering as a blueprint of what is essential to our human functions, especially emotion and cognition, deflates the sense of wonder we may possess about human life. New life need no longer be a surprise. In certain cases, it no longer is a surprise. With prenatal diagnosis, we already can trouble ourselves to know the sex of a fetus and whether or not it will suffer from a variety of diseases. Sophisticated genetic methods have been increasingly exploited in attempts to account for how we behave, developments in science that have been alluded to several times today. Genetic explanations have been advanced in recent years, as Time magazine, that exemplar of popular culture, has noted, for homosexuality, smoking, divorce, schizophrenia, alcoholism, shyness, political liberalism, intelligence, religiosity, and cancer, among the many aspects of human life for which it is claimed that biology is destiny. Genetics has weighed in dramatically, for example, on the violence front. In October 1993, a Dutch-American team reported in Science magazine that an apparent mutation of a gene on the X chromosome of males in a particular Dutch family might be responsible for what science said called a syndrome of borderline mental retardation and abnormal behavior, including antisocial acts such as arson and attempted rape. The genetics of behavior has been complemented by the rapidly expanding neurosciences. They have been exposing, or at least proposing to expose, how our senses and cognitive abilities are the products of neurotransmitters, hormone surges, neural networks, and the 100 billion intricately connected nerve cells that comprise our 3 pounds of custard-like gray matter that you saw in Steve Pinker's illustration. Now, we have to remember that phrenologists explained behavioral tendencies in the 19th century in terms of bumps on the head. Neurobiologists, I sometimes think, are asking us to conduct or join with them in what amounts, as I say, I sometimes think, to a kind of internal phrenology. They can see and show us what is going on in our heads, as Steve Pinker did, with the imaging technologies of CAT scan, magnetic resonance imaging, PET scanning, and so on. They can observe brain structure, and with the scanning technologies of PET and fast MRI, they can detect function in particular regions of the brain, keying on neurotransmitters. These methods have been used in the study of diseases such as Parkinson's, but also in the analysis, to a significant extent, of abnormal, especially socially destructive behaviors. Neuroscientists have isolated and begun to study the roles of several neurotransmitters in suicidal patients, depressives, and people prone to impulsive violence. They have connected both excesses and insufficiencies of the chemicals serotonin and dopamine with impulsive violent behavior, as well as with diseases of the brain like Parkinson's. Researchers at one institution observed the nature of activity in the frontal and parietal lobes of the brain in criminals who commit impulsive aggression, and found that these structures, that the activity there was different from the activity in normal persons, and hence the inference was drawn that this difference in activity is what is responsible for the criminal behavior. Many scientists expect that the neurosciences and human genetics will ultimately meld, so that specific genes or clusters of them are correlated with what brain scans reveal. The result will be a genetic functional account of our behavior, and in more than one sense of our human identities. The premise, not an unreasonable one, is that it is in our materiality and the physiological processes that govern them that our capacities for being human reside. Biologists hold that these capacities, again not unreasonably, even those for art and aesthetics, are the selected products of evolution. E.O. Wilson, for example, has argued that natural selection has favored rules coded into this materiality for behaviors that foster our survival. For example, investment in children, status striving, signaling with facial expressions such as the smile, and even contractual agreement. It has thus created a human nature, this evolution has, the embodiment in all of us of certain norms of behavior or modes of actions. These developments in genetics and neuroscience have lent themselves to a remarkable shift, I would suggest, in the social uses of human biology in late 20th century America. Recall that early in this century, biological explanations of behavior in the form of social Darwinism and its transmutation into eugenics were brandished by conservatives. They deployed them as weapons against seeking improvement in the condition of individuals and groups through amelioration of the social environment. Eugenicists saw the proliferation of such people as a threat to the quality of American society. Biological eugenics was early embraced by progressives and not only conservatives. They indulge in a kind of biological engineering, if you will, not just the social engineering that Steve Pinker alluded to. They sought to halt the trend of degeneration, if you will, a kind of counter-revolution, by passing eugenic sterilization laws. And the laws were upheld in 1927 by the Supreme Court of the United States in the case of Buck v. Bell by a majority of 8-1. The majority's opinion was delivered by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., who endorsed blocking the transmission of the taint of feeble-mindedness alleged to be hereditary in Carrie Buck's line. Here is an example of how, if you parse Judge Holmes' decision, of how the idea of using science for progressive purposes could lead to curtailments or damage to individual liberty. Holmes wrote, "We have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. It would be strange if it could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices," meaning an interference with their reproductive rights, "often not felt to be such by those concerned, in order to prevent our being swamped with incompetence. It is better for all the world," he went on, "if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination," and here he is alluding to a larger public good and equating the prevention of the spread of disease with the prevention of degeneration. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles, he concluded in a phrase that is rung infamously down through the corridors of legal history, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. But now the biologization of behavior is not taken, at least not yet, as a warrant for this kind of, if you will, scientific social engineering. It is, in fact, I would suggest, being taken, at least in popular culture, as sort of emancipatory from responsibility. The argument goes that if it's in your nature to misbehave, then it's not your fault. Alan Anderson, editor of The New Scientist, has written, "People begin to see themselves not as wholes with a moral center, but the result of the combined action of parts for which they have little responsibility." It's nobody's fault is the title of a popular American book on difficult children. There is nothing wrong with them, Anderson goes on, nothing wrong with them or the way they have been brought up. Rather, the part of the brain which controls attention is just simply short of a particular neurotransmitter. Now, biologists know, of course, that the operating organism, what they call the phenotype, is the product of neither genes nor of environment alone, but of the interaction of the two. One response to a no-fault biology, if you will, might be that the environment needs to be modified so as to compensate for the biological defect that, for example, makes someone a social misfit. However, the prevailing response at the end of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st is not to fix the social environment, it is to resort to the remedy of pharmaceuticals in the main to deal with the biological defect chemically. Prominent examples include the reliance on Ritalin to deal with attention deficit disorder, or Prozac to minister to depression, or the countless drugs that are prescribed for mental and behavioral disorders by psychologists and psychiatrists. The best-selling Listening to Prozac claimed that the drug can transform pessimists into optimists, turn loners into extroverts. Prozac is a harbinger of medicines which, rather than correcting particular illnesses, affect clusters of functions in the human brain. But Alan Anderson has further observed the more direct means we have of changing who we are through changing the parts, that we are composed of, the harder becomes the question of who was the person who made the decision to change before becoming someone else. It has long been said that you can't change human nature. What we are beginning to hear now, if only as a subject of contemporary discourse of the decomposition of human nature, is that you can change it. We are confronted constantly with the prediction that eventually we will be able to intervene in the genome. The intervention may take the form of gene therapies for the treatment of disease. It may go further to the engineering of genetic changes that will be passed on to our children. Germline changes may comprise protections against disease. For example, weeding the gene for Huntington's disease out of a familial line, or it may entail enhancements of the sort that Lee Silver discusses, especially for characteristics that our culture deems valuable, such as intelligence, athletic ability, and beauty, or the ability to put a basketball through a hoop at 30 feet. We may be able to order specific types of biological persons, people engineered to order much as they are in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Presumably they will be human in form, but one can imagine that in nature some of them at least may bear as much relationship to our conventional notions of that concept as, say, the savage does to the alphas in Huxley's novel. Among the remarkable features of the trend to biologization is that it has been occurring in an intensely commercial free market environment. In that regard, we need not wait for the engineering of Brave New World to be apprehensive about the consequences to which the biologization of identity might lead. Just the acquisition of genetic information about ourselves, if it shows that we are prone to a genetic disease, can be used to deny medical insurance or employment. The incentives for traffic in human body parts, including the parts in which our essence is concentrated, are powerful. Advertisements appear regularly in elite college newspapers, offering up to $50,000 for the eggs of a good-looking woman to make a baby in vitro. In the legally sanctioned realm of commodification, patent protection has been extended to genetically engineered plants, animals, and human genes. Critics of the trend contend that it may be further extended to genetically engineered human body parts, perhaps even to human beings themselves. In 1995, a leader of the Southern Baptist Convention's Christian Life Commission spoke for numerous clerics of all religious stripes when he admonished, "The patenting of human genetic material attempts to wrest ownership from God and commodifies human biological materials and potentially human beings themselves. The image of God pervades human life in all of its parts," he went on. Furthermore, the right to own one part of a human being is ceteris paribus, the right to own all parts of a human being. This right, he concluded, must not be transferred from the creator to the creature. Recently, William Salatin, the thoughtful Slate columnist, commented, "Human ingenuity in a grand synthesis of agriculture, manufacturing, and information technology is dissolving human nature. If we can dissolve, then we can engineer." Worries along that line have troubled political theorist Francis Fukuyama, who has expressed in a recent book, Our Post-Human Future, concern that about the potential impact of biotechnology on ineffable human qualities such as individuality, ambition, or genius. He finds disturbing harbingers of the direction human genetic modification might take precisely in the uses now being made of Prozac and Ritalin. He says, perhaps caricaturing how these drugs are used, that the former is often prescribed for depressed women lacking in self-esteem, the latter largely for young boys who don't want to sit still in class. In his view, the two drugs together are nudging the two sexes, as he says, towards that androgynous median personality, self-satisfied and socially compliant, that is the current politically correct outcome in American society. More such drugs are sure to come, he warns, all of them with profound political implications because they will make deviant behavior into a pathology meriting chemical restoration to a conformist norm. Fukuyama predicts that human genetic engineering might well change human nature and adds that the prospect worries him enormously because human nature is fundamental, in his view, to our notions of justice, morality, and any meaningful definition of human rights. He contends, for example, that human rights based on our inclination to protect kin rather than strangers provides a more solid foundation for political order than those that, so he seems to imply, obligate us to care for, say, welfare mothers or the impoverished peoples in the third world. Fukuyama's biotechnological prognostications, his fear that we are going to reach a post-human future, I would like to argue, are, to say the least, selective, tailored to his particular kind of alarmism. He chooses sociobiological characteristics as constitutive of human nature that are consistent with his devotion to liberal democratic capitalism, ignoring those, for example, tribalism, submissiveness to authority, and the subordination of women to reproduction that seem to make large parts of the world decidedly resistant to the freedom and political structures of the West, the jubilation in Baghdad of recent days to the contrary notwithstanding. Despite his selectivity, Fukuyama is unwilling to leave the biotechnological enterprise to its own devices, fearing that it is too driven by commerce and ambition to exercise self-restraint. In the closing section of his book, he calls for a departure from free market capitalism, at least in biotechnology, that is, national and international regulation. For starters, the United States should follow other countries in banning reproductive human cloning, he says, not primarily because it might be unsafe for the fetus, but mainly because if we don't, we will legitimate far more wide-ranging biotechnological manipulations of human beings. It is important to lay down a political marker at an early point, he says, to demonstrate that the development of these technologies is not inevitable, that societies can control the pace of technological advance. I think that Fukuyama's heresy from the current religion of free market capitalism may attract many adherents. They may not be convinced that a post-human world is really on the horizon, as I'm not, by the way, but they are no less disturbed than he by the exercise of untrammeled freedom in human biotechnology. Pace Lee Silver. Still, I suspect that, like Fukuyama, many people are overreacting to the prospects of human biotechnology. The trend to biologization has been pervaded by considerable scientific extravagance, a good deal of which has been detailed by Steve Pinker earlier this afternoon. No one knows much about how genes actually control behavior, or how neural networks make for perception and knowledge, or how the complex system of the brain works to create consciousness. The distinguished MIT biologist Eric Lander has said of the human genome, it's a parts list, like a list for the components of a 747. I don't expect to see human nature in the code. Concerning commodification through patents, when the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office ruled in 1987 that animals could be patented, it also held that human beings could not. The ruling pointed to the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which of course outlawed slavery, noting that no person can now hold a property right in another. Still, as William Salatin has observed, the immediate threat posed by the unraveling of the old physical and moral distinctions between human beings and human parts, organisms and non-organisms, subjects and objects, is that private interests will come to own the stuff of which we are made. We need ethics in this realm. If ethics is relegated to peripheral and obsolete questions while industry deconstructs, redesigns, and manufactures human components just like any other commodity, laws that exempt these components from patenting, licensing, and other property rights will lose their moral basis. And critics who object that human is sacred won't have a leg to stand on. It is the United States that has taken the lead in the recent biologization and commercialization of the constituencies of human nature. It is the old world that so far has taken the more effective lead in the introduction of ethics into that latter endeavor. I don't have time to go into that, but suffice it to say that given the globalization of the high-tech economy, it may be that a similar impact will be felt here in how we treat the deconstruction of human nature, at least in the commercial, if not in its conceptual configurations. In conclusion, as for that conceptual matter, we managed to absorb our Copernican dethronement from the center of the universe, and people who accept Darwinian evolution do not nowadays resort to a primitive nihilism. For example, most Americans, I think, have repudiated the kind of thinking that prevailed in the heyday of eugenics, with its attribution of biological inferiority to poor whites and minority groups, especially immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. The revelations of the Holocaust helped raise moral objections to eugenics and sterilization, and so did the increasing worldwide discussion of human rights. Since the late 40s, the movement for women's rights and reproductive freedom has further transformed moral sensibilities about eugenics, so that even without knowing how shoddy the science was and how unfair the process was that sanctified constitutionally the sterilization of Carrie Buck, even without knowing all that, we recoil at the reasoning in the majority's ruling in Buck v. Bell. Having come so far from the attitudes that suffuse the eugenics movement, we can surely learn to live with the knowledge that we're creatures of parts, of genes, neurons, and whatever else. Whether there is a human nature or not, whether if there is we are deconstructing it or not, we can think of ourselves as something more than the operations of genes and firing neurons. And then just to close with a comment on a question that Lee Silver raised in one of the sessions earlier, I don't see that there is an inevitability to human evolution, a way there was inevitability, so to speak, or a lack of control over the evolution of other organisms. We are the first species able to be conscious of our evolution and hence to do something about it. The same scientific knowledge and engineering techniques that permit us possibly to control our evolution by way of changing ourselves also permit us not to change it, make any changes whatsoever. That's the flip side of the possibilities of the genetic engineering of human beings. Whatever we do, we can and should insist on treatment of people that respects personhood, autonomy, and dignity, even if we know that we are all the construction of various parts. Thank you.
Dan and I actually didn't talk before or coordinate our talks, but I don't think we could have coordinated them any better had we. Mine is actually going to follow his. Depending on which program you're reading, the title of my talk is either To Be Announced or Geneism, Racism, and the Prospect of Genetic Genocide, and the latter is actually the real title. When I was invited to do this, I have Ken Lewes's letter. He said that the spectrum he expected on the program was from unqualified utopian thinking, which I think we've heard a lot of today, to equally unmitigated forebodings of catastrophe, which is, I guess that's my line, and that's where I'll come in. Dan took us up to the present, and I am going to try to look at the future, keeping in mind the old saying that is sometimes attributed to Nostradamus, but other times to Yogi Berra, that prediction is difficult, especially about the future. And that's true. I'm not using PowerPoint or slides, even though I often do, but I do want you to picture a cartoon up there, which is one of my favorites since I'm a lawyer, which is the picture of 5 cavemen with giant clubs talking about what they're going to do next to further humanity, and one of them says, well, the first thing we have to do is set up regulatory agencies. That may not strike people as the first thing we have to do, but what I want you to be thinking of during my 20 or 25 minutes is it possible to, in the future, either, number one, or both, as Dan has said, do we really have a choice to stop either nanotechnology or germline genetic engineering that may create a different kind of human, if not a different species altogether? And no matter how you answer that question, if we do, nonetheless, create a different kind of species, is there a mechanism that we humans can develop that can help direct the use of that technology and protect, as Christine Peterson put it out, protect the rest of us humans from annihilation, extinction, or exploitation by this new powerful subspecies or species. Okay? Geneticists, scientists in general, I think, tend to be optimistic about the field in which they work, that it's going to all work out well in the end, and that the dangers that many people talk about, whether it's the Europeans talking about genetically modified foods or others speculating about genocide, genetic genocide, as I will later, that we really don't understand the facts. Steve Pinker just argued that bioethicists should get serious and should be based on facts. Their work should be based on facts, not fantasy. In fact, this slide, if I read it right, said bioethics policy should be based on facts and not fantasy. I didn't know there was any bioethics policy, Steve, I don't, but we certainly use bioethics politics. I'll go that far with you. But why bioethics should be based on facts, but science can be based on speculation and assume that the only good is going to come from technology and not the bad, escapes me. So I think we can both fantasize about both good and bad. When the Genome Project, well, the first draft, it turns out, the Genome Project was first announced. You remember, the President brought Craig Venter and Francis Collins to the White House, had them take joint credit for that task. And the President said, we are now reading the language of God. It was a little, maybe a little extreme. But after that announcement, many other scientists around the world chimed in on what this meant. And one of the things they talked about was what it meant for the concept of racism, probably the most destructive concept in the history of the world. And my favorite one was Chris Stinger of London's Natural History Museum. He said, quote, "This shows that we are all Africans under the skin." Another scientist used the term race is only skin deep. And Craig Venter said that now we know race is a social concept. I think we knew that before, not a scientific one. We all evolved in the last 100,000 years from the same small number of tribes that migrated out of Africa and colonized the world. And their view was echoing a view that other geneticists had been predicting and saying about the Genome Project for the last 10 years, I'm sure you've all heard it, that the Genome Project is going to prove that we're all fundamentally the same, right? That we all have 99.9% of the same DNA. And therefore, we're all going to be one big family after the Genome Project is over. And we're going to abolish racism and abolish all these differences among human beings. That would be nice. I'd like that. Most of us would like that. And for about a year, that held. Last year, during the last years, and you've seen these articles in the New England Journal of Medicine and others, there's a counterattack on this now, saying, no, 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 this is wrong, that really maybe race isn't biological, but we still have to study individual races, members of individual races, because, you know, drugs are going to act differently on blacks and on whites. We're going to have different rates of metabolism, different this and different that. And so that really, it's not true, that there aren't some fundamental biological differences among the races. That fight is still going on, by the way. But the point is not who's right or who's wrong in that, but that the hype that the Human Genome Project is going to end racism is obviously not happening. That was always hype. Whether or not the second hype that we can someday, I think Lee Silver is now talking 10,000 years into the future, perhaps, someday way in the future, actually use germline genetics to make a, quote, better baby, a designer baby, baby with different genetic characteristics. I'm going to assume we can for the purposes of this discussion, because if we can't do it, either using nanotechnology to make better adults or germline genetics to make different children, then it's true. We don't have to worry very much about this new technology. We only have to worry and try to protect the subjects of these human experiments who will be injured by them while we try to prove we can't do it. But it won't have species-wide implications for the future of humans. And what I want to talk about are species-wide implications. Well, should we even be talking about that? Well, if we're talking 200 years in the future, we can talk about species-wide implications. But Václav Havel is actually the only person I've ever heard use the term species consciousness, which I thought was actually a pretty terrific term. And he argued that the only way the human species will survive was if we develop a species consciousness. He was mostly talking about totalitarian dictatorships and the development of weapons that can destroy the planet and their probable use in the future if we don't come to a species-wide agreement that we're not going to use things like that to resolve our differences. Nonetheless, consistent with this is the history that Dan just talked about, Frank Fukuyama and his new book about the post-human. His notion that human rights are a function of human nature, if you will, or what it means to be human, that human rights are kind of natural law thought process that people go through and have gone through to think of what things we as a species see as essential in each other that demands protection. Sometimes it's called human dignity. Actually, I like Fukuyama's definition of human dignity. It's factor X, he calls it, because nobody can actually put their, almost like a soul, nobody can put their hands on it, but we know it's there. And what is it that we want to protect? After World War II, you'll recall, in 1948, the nations of the world adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was really the first time such a declaration had ever been adopted. And the important thing, two of those phrases are important. One is universal. It was meant to apply to everyone in the world, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, whatever. And number two, that there are human rights, that there were such a thing as human rights. Remember, this was a year after the Nuremberg Tribunal, the first, some would argue the last, truly international criminal law court, which tried the major German criminals, which came up with the Nuremberg Principles, which is there are such things as war crimes and crimes against humanity, right? People can be punished, individuals can be punished for committing war crimes and crimes against humanity, and I was just obeying orders is not a defense. We've heard lots about that during the war in the last couple of weeks. But it does show you, which I think helps show you how powerful those notions are. No matter whether you believe that there are such things as human rights, whether you believe we can enforce human rights, or whether you believe it is possible for humans actually not to commit crimes against humanity. Nonetheless, I think we would all say, even the president, who is the most non-international president we've had certainly in a long time, that international law matters. And you heard him more than once in the last 2 weeks say the Geneva Conventions are international law, and we are going to hold people responsible if they violate the Geneva Conventions. Now, the Geneva Conventions are part of what's known as humanitarian law of war, which I've always found is kind of an oxymoron, right? And it was kind of strange for us to argue for a while. The U.S. was arguing that this was a humanitarian war in Iraq. Are we still arguing that? I don't know if we are or not. But humanitarians would distinguish between humanitarianism and humanitarian aid, obviously, and military operations, and most military people do too. Nonetheless, there are rules of war, and not following them are war crimes, and they're universal crimes. Now, what I want to talk about is a separate kind of crime. I mean, crimes against humanity are the big ones that I think we'd all agree with: murder, genocide, slavery, torture, arbitrary detention, disappearances, things of that nature, right? What I would argue is there's a different kind of crime against humanity. I don't know what to call it, type 2 crime or not, but it's a crime that doesn't involve these types of destructive activities loosed on individuals with the permission or blessing of the state, and that's required for a crime against humanity. Rather, it is a direct attack, if you will, on the human species itself, qua human species. Right? It is an effort to change the nature of what it means to be human, to engage in what I will call, but and believe me, I know it's difficult to define, a species-altering activity. Okay? Well, what might they be? Like making germline genetic changes in an individual that may make that individual so much different than other individual members of the human species that we might consider him or her not a member of the species, or a subspecies, or a different species. I don't want to get hung up on species, because I'm first to admit that's a very plastic notion, and species aren't fixed, and they do change, and the human species will change as well. Or changing a fundamental characteristic of what it means to be human. And I would argue, and we can argue later, I mean, I don't think cloning is the end of the world if people clone, and even if 1,000 people clone. Nonetheless, I think human cloning is a perfect, well, it turned out not to be quite perfect, but is an extremely important opportunity for the world community, because every country in the world, I'll put it this way, no country in the world has said that it sanctions human cloning, and every country in the world that's taken a position on human cloning has voted to outlaw it. Right? So what I think, and I've argued, that human cloning gives us an opportunity as a world community for the first time to work together and ban something we could do at some point, human cloning, ban a procedure that has worldwide implications, species implications, if you will. And I would also ban germline genetic engineering. And I'm open to talking about nanotechnology and other species-altering technologies. Probably that term would obviously have to be defined in the treaty. All these types of interventions that threaten to change the nature of what it means to be human. Because Fukuyama, in a sense, is right about this, that when you change the nature of what it means to be human, you undermine and undercut and perhaps take away the basis for human rights, and democracy, which are the two capstones, I would argue, of humans so far. And Christine Peterson argued very forcefully, I thought, that she would never want to see anything done coercively to anybody, that she'd always want it to be voluntary. Well, that's a fundamental human right, right? Not to have your body invaded or forced, whether it's sterilization or even whether it's adding an implant into your brain to improve you, to have anything done to your body against your will. It's fundamental to autonomy, personhood, and that's something that's upheld by human rights. I don't know how you'd uphold it in something, in a creature that was different. Right? So if you had this treaty, by the way, I think that it's not just bioethicists or philosophers that might favor a treaty like this, but frontline scientists have come forward and said they think this is absolutely right, by the way. Eric Lander is a perfect example, who said on many occasions, he says, I think germline genetic engineering should be banned. He thinks it's the height of hubris for us to think that we know how to change our 3.5 million year old DNA sequence to make better children. And And he's in favor of it. And I think most, not all scientists are, but I don't think the scientific community would stand in the way of that. Now, that's not the end in itself. The next step would be to set up two things. One, an enforcement mechanism, which would have to be something like the International Criminal Court, right? Which the United States is not a member to, nor is China or India, two countries that Charles Cantor rightfully, I think, pointed out are going to be at the forefront of these technologies, and so they have to be involved, obviously, as well. And that's why you need an international treaty to get everybody involved, not just a U.S. law, which is almost useless, except symbolically, as we're going to be part of an international community. All right? So you'd have to set up the enforcement mechanism through the International Criminal Court or a separate court, but I think you have to use that one. And thirdly, you'd have to have a mechanism. This is probably the hardest thing. Actually, I think the first two are non-trivial political issues, but are possible. But the hardest thing is to set up a forum. I don't want to analogize it to institutional review boards or ethics committees or even the President's Bioethics Council, but it's in that nature of an international bioethics human rights council, democratically elected in some way, representative of the entire species, proportionately, hopefully, and it would be their job to debate issues like cloning, germline genetics, nanotechnology, xenografts, any type of procedure that either was species altering or that put the human species at risk of extinction. And you could only do it, first they'd all be outlawed by the treaty, and you could only change that treaty on their recommendation, that you have been able to show that the benefits to humanity, not just to one individual or one little group, outweigh the likely risks to humanity, or that there's some fundamental principle involving human personhood that we don't want to violate. Then a risk-benefit analysis alone wouldn't be enough. But they would make the decision. So it's not that it's permanent ever, forever. Nothing's permanent ever, forever in the human species. But that it's an application of what the environmentalists call a precautionary principle to species-altering procedures. The new principle is that the burden of proof would be on the scientists, the proponents, the corporations, to show the world community why this is a good thing, rather than as it is now on the world community, which hardly exists, to show the scientists and Congress and whoever else is regulating this why this is so dangerous that it shouldn't be done. So it's that shift in the burden of proof, going to an international regulatory mechanism that is the radical departure. Now, what's the justification for it? Well, the justification for it is that there really is a potential, not just to change the nature of being human, that we're all granting, and that could be good or bad. I'm not arguing it's necessarily bad. But there's a potential for genocide. Now, am I being overly dramatic on that? Because I think if there is a real potential for genocide, that's a good and sufficient reason to try to prevent doing what you're doing. Well, this is not original with me. Many speakers have said, let's talk about science fiction. Science fiction writers have been writing about this for a long time. Olaf Stapleton's classic book, The Last and First Man, which if you haven't read, I highly commend it to you. He envisions millions of years of genetic engineering and all kinds of different human beings types, some that are like dolphins who could swim in the ocean, some with wings that fly. But inevitably, the other humans decide they don't like them for one reason or another and kill them all. Right? That the genocidal impetus takes place. Nancy Kress in her series, Beggars in Spain, again, I highly commend that book to you as well. She imagines the first genetic engineer is going to be to produce children who don't have to sleep. And it turns out they have a tremendous advantage then. Right? They get to work 24 hours a day. They're top in their class. They take over all the corporations. And eventually, well, you can guess what happens. The sleepers resent them a lot and try to kill them. First, they force them off to their own planet. They actually make their own planet. And ultimately, it does end genocidally. And almost inevitably. Nanotechnology, people who think a lot about nanotechnology and robotic technology, especially using interfaces, have come to a similar conclusion. Hans Moravec, who studied his book Mind Children and his most recent book on robots, said this, looking into the future, without restrictions, transformed humans, these are ones who are transformed with implants, binary implants, of arbitrary power and little accountability, might routinely trample the planet deliberately or accidentally. A good compromise, it seems to me, he says, would be to allow anyone to perfect their biology within broad biological bounds. They could make themselves healthier, we've talked about that, more beautiful, stronger, more intelligent, and longer lived. They could not use machinery, however, to make themselves as powerful or as smart as robots, who he assumes are going to be the most powerful people, most powerful entities on Earth. Those who cannot tolerate the restrictions would be offered a radical escape clause, because we're going to treat everybody nice, right? So to exceed the limits, one must renounce legal standing as a human being, I like that, including the right to corporate police protection, to subsidized income, and to influence laws, and the right to reside on the Earth. In return, one gets severance payments sufficient to establish a comfortable space homestead and absolute freedom to make one's own way in the cosmos. So that's another view, right? And that's a safety view. That's actually a Blade Runner view, if you've seen the movie or even read Williams Burroughs' totally different screenplay. You know, the Blade Runner, the artificial people who were 10 times stronger than humans, were so dangerous that they were not permitted to live on Earth. They had to go somewhere else. And so anyone who thinks seriously about this knows that once we create a class of artificial people, like robots, enhanced people, whether it's with nanotechnology or computer technology or genetically engineered people, that the danger exists of genocide, that the danger is real. And again, science fiction writers and others have thought seriously about segregating those populations immediately. So that, again, I don't think the conclusion is radical. The hardest question, well, those are non-trivial things, how to set up, how to get the treaty passed. And I say it's non-trivial because we can't even get the United States to get behind the cloning treaty, which is in front of the United Nations right now. Because the United States' position is they don't only want to outlaw reproductive cloning, they want to outlaw research cloning too. And so I was discussing with some people at noontime, that's not going to happen. We should go the other way. We should outlaw reproductive cloning and germline genetic engineering. The fight to outlaw research cloning strikes me as a non-starter. Although if you believe the article in today's Science magazine, even reproductive cloning may be impossible in primates, and even research cloning may be extraordinarily difficult, much more difficult than we thought. So maybe that's fine. Maybe we outline it won't do anything to science at all. But the hardest part, I think, seems to me, is if you did set up this mechanism and you all agreed that there is this giant group of philosopher kings who get to decide whether we want to change the species or not, what would their rules be? I mean, it would be cost benefit, but it would be more than that. I mean, when would it be safe? When would the planet be safe, for example, for a new species? And I'll just throw this out. I mean, I haven't thought this through, but I would think one rule might be that the species would have to go 100 years without a genocide before the species could be thought safe enough to introduce another species or a subspecies. So far, everyone I've tried this 100 years on, I can try it on you too, say, well, that's not possible. We could never go 100 years without a genocide. Well, it seems to me if we can't go 100 years without killing ourselves, who are not enhanced in any way changed, we certainly can't be trusted to try to create new humans. Thank you. Oh, we can call him. Steve?
So, is this microphone on? Is this the placebo effect?
Everybody asks that question, so it's probably not.
If I understand you, you're calling for an international
I can hear you. Yeah.
international regulatory body that would have the power to presumably throw scientists in jail if they violated one of the guidelines, and that
Now, the body wouldn't get to throw them in jail, but that's the idea. Somebody would have to prosecute them in front of the International Criminal Court for not following the treaty. Yeah, for violating the treaty. Yes, correct.
So scientists would be thrown in jail for certain research projects, and they wouldn't be able to.
Oh, I got a new one. Okay.
And that there would be some kind of bureaucratic apparatus that would decide which scientists, what kind of research would land scientists in jail. And the reason is because of, if I understand it, that it's based on your speculations from science fiction on what might happen 10,000 years in the future, including the possibility, or including the belief, that if there's any difference that's genetically engineered, that will lead to genocide?
I would say that's oversimplified.
I mean, one reason for...
Species-altering changes, not any difference, obviously.
Let's say as you know, I'm skeptical that this is
That's fine.
possible, but let's say there were an alteration that would lead to an extra 10 IQ points.
Not species-altering, obviously. It's within what we already see. I'm not saying nature is a guide, but here, if you do something that lots of people already have, that's hard to see that's species-altering.
Let's say it's 50 IQ points.
No, at some point you're going to get there. You're the smartest person in the world now, and yeah.
Yeah, so...
yes, if you can do a whole bunch of those people.
I'm going to question one of your premises.
Okay.
And by extension, I'm going to question the rather extreme argument that you've made that an international bureaucracy, with all of the quirks that and fads and superstitions that bureaucracies are prone to, should be able to criminalize free inquiry. Now, I probably know people who are 50 IQ points below me, and I know people who are 50 IQ points above me.
I know lots of.
I don't want to kill the people who are 50 IQ points below me, and I don't think the people who are 50 IQ points above me want to kill me. So I'm going to challenge the idea that a genetic enhancement will inevitably lead to genocide. Maybe it will, but people have committed genocide on far flimsier differences than that. Given that you're making a kind of an armchair claim about human psychology, for which you didn't provide any evidence, don't you think the kind of reasoning that would criminalize science based on an international bureaucracy should be based on stronger premises than that, given the possible costs in the stifling of biomedical research by committees that may be subject to all kinds of fads and superstitions and all the kinds of things that we know that national regulatory bodies can be prone to, and for which international competition therefore enhances diversity?
There's no question. I mean, it's not going to be their say-so. It's the treaty itself is going to set the limits of what's lawful and what's unlawful, as treaties do now, by the way, and as crimes against humanity do now. The agency that's set up would be the one that would break the treaty. Would say, no, here. We don't need it anymore. We don't need to restrict germline genetics anymore. We don't need to restrict nanotechnology anymore. Okay, they wouldn't decide what to do. The rules would be set by the treaty. How each country would vote on the treaty, I would like obviously every country to be democratic. They're not. So that's tough. All treaties are tough. All right, setting that up is tough. And after that, what will we lose? I mean, again, the only thing we should lose are species-altering technologies. And in terms of armchair, I mean, I think just the last 20 years of world history teaches us that genocides are routine. Well, the Pulitzer Prize was just won by a woman who chronicled America's role in genocide just in the last 100 years in the world, and it's not a pretty picture. So I'd recommend Samantha Power's book to you.
No, since I lost the Pulitzer Prize to her for that book, I would appreciate that.
You modestly say, all right, you want to kill her for that? Or?
Okay. In a way, okay. That's my point.
Okay.
The idea
you don't. Okay, I understand.
That
jump in?
Genocides are so common.
I'm sorry.
The idea that we should have a huge increase in armed control over inquiry seems to me to be.
Well, let me ask you. Let me put it differently. So, do you think people should make smallpox in their basement?
No. But that's
why should we control that?
Because we know that it leads to concrete harm to specific individuals, whereas we don't
hasn't for a long time. It hasn't been 40 years. Haven't had any smallpox in this world.
No, because the probabilities of it leading to harm to actual human beings are within a reasonable range that it is reasonable to give up the freedom in order to prevent happening. Whereas for something that's so hypothetical that to defend it you have to appeal to science fiction. There, the increase in government power, indeed, world government power.
Yeah, I think it's no more hypothetical than your not your personal, but speculation we've heard here today that nanotechnology is going to build human hearts and that we'll have an artificial heart that functions or that we're going to have genetically engineered kids. I know you didn't say that.
No, but I agree with that. But those people aren't advocating a huge increase in regulatory and government power.
No, because they want to do these things. Yeah. They don't want regulation. Right, you're right.
Can I jump in here just briefly? Several short points. One is I'm glad to hear you say that this treaty could be broken because it's this regulatory treaty, because it seems to me that it would be a real act of hubris of us and maybe kind of chronological imperialism to legislate for all generations 10,000 years in the future. This is a kind of perverse biological notion of Justice Bork's idea of original intent. And I don't think we want to get into that. Now, that said, I do, as I said in my own remarks, think that it's not a bad idea to think about regulating human biotechnology, but not in some omnibus way that all of it is to be prohibited. I think it has to be done on a case-by-case basis. We do that already with rules on human subject research. And those, I think, are good and valuable rules, and that we ought to incorporate human biotechnology into them. The next point is that I myself would not ever argue for a blanket prohibition against germline engineering of human beings. If you could get rid of Huntington's disease, the gene for it, onto the nth generation, why not? I don't see anything adverse about that. So that's what I mean by on a case-by-case basis. And the last point I would raise is that it seems to me that these ideas about species change are really, I don't know exactly what that means or how that could be brought about. There's 6 billion people on the planet. So how are we going to affect the change in the whole species by applying to some people, and let's not forget the economics of this, those who can afford it, to some people who can afford it, certain types of genetic germline engineering. I just don't see it as something that's going to ripple through all 6 billion people on the planet and their descendants. So this notion that we're going to change the species, I think ought to just be either it ought to be specified about how that's going to happen, because I don't see how it's going to happen, or if it is going to, if we are going to discuss how it's going to happen, or if we're not going to be explained how it's going to happen, that ought to be removed from the discussion, because it's, I just think with all due respect, George, that that's meaningless.
I may have not made myself clear. It's not that we're going to change the 6 billion people. It's just that we're going to change a few people who are then going to be seen not like the other 6 billion people. And either the 6 billion are going to kill them, or they'll try to kill the 6 billion.
Can we tighten up the definition of species? I think that
Species don't.
that would be helpful here. So a species is a cohort that can interbreed and have fertile offspring.
Well, that's the old, I mean, that's a technical biological
That's the technical
definition.
biological
Right.
definition. Once you allow for cloning, any organism that's capable of self-cloning, by definition,
Right.
could be a species.
I agree.
Okay? So what happens after you have multiple species that can coexist in the same niche will depend on their competitive advantages and disadvantages, again, in classical evolution. So I don't think necessarily that a clone would lead to extinction of the non-clonable part of the species, if you will. But I mean, I can give you an extreme view of this just to think about. So people with certain chromosome translocations cannot have fertile offspring by mating with normal people. But you could engineer mates for them. And so you could have a quote-unquote species in the traditional sense, which could only propagate by intermarriage and could not intermarry with the rest. Now, would you outlaw that?
Would I outlaw that? I think it's a pretty extreme way to go to allow one person to, you know, who can't to have children any other way to have children that way. Yeah, I may outlaw that. You know, I may indeed outlaw that. The problem with cloning is not, the cloning problem is just the opportunity. The cloning problem is not, has nothing to do with genocide. The cloning problem is the question of who on earth, if anybody, has the moral warrant to change the definition of what it means, to take away sexual reproduction from the human definition of human, because the clones are going to be human children. I certainly believe there are human children. They got all the attributes anybody's talked about. That just gives us the opportunity to look broader into bioethical issues on a planetary level.
I would suggest to you, George, and others, though, that if human cloning is made safe and effective, the first picture, like Louise Brown, plastered all over the newspapers, front page of the newspapers of the world, will dissolve all the opposition to
You know,
reproductive
and I agree
cloning.
with that. That's why I've said 100 times, and I'll say it again if anybody missed it. That's not the tragedy. It's not a tragedy if one human clone is born, or if 100 is born, or 1,000 is born, or 10,000 is born. Right? That doesn't change the fact any more than murder changed the fact that they don't have the moral warrant to do that. I don't think. I mean, I don't. You know.
I went to engage Dan on something that I was surprised to hear you say, which was this notion that components of human bodies are deserving of a higher level of dignity than
No. I only meant to say that even though we know increasingly that we are constructed of components, that we can deconstruct ourselves into components, that the totality of ourselves, which is the accumulation of all those things as they work together, continues to warrant autonomy, respect, and dignity. It's not that the parts themselves warrant that.
Okay. I just want to make the comment, as I'm sure you know, but it's important to understand that at this moment there's a bill being debated in the Senate that would make it illegal to play with cloned human embryos, just the embryos and the cells themselves, and put somebody in jail for 10 years and fine them at least $1 million. Now, I thought that you were following along. I didn't think you were following along those lines exactly.
No, I'm opposed to that. I'm
right
opposed to
now,
that
I mean,
bill.
this is a real, I mean, if the embryo cloning can happen,
Yeah.
and then this is something that's facing us right now. People are looking at human components and giving them dignity, suggesting that we're sanctifying them in some way.
Yeah, I strongly disagree with the Senate bill because it's built on the premise that the conceptus within the first 2 weeks of its life, so to speak, is a human being, and I just don't agree with that.
Now, George, I think, has actually, you have some sympathy for that position.
No, actually, I don't. I've written many, many times. I'm opposed reproductive cloning. I support research cloning, and I always have.
I have a question that, well, I guess I have a couple questions. The first is for Dan, and the second is for both of you. The first question about the parts list. That's actually a refrain in the literature these days. What the Genome Project gave us what the Genome Project gave us is a parts list, and the usual meaning of that is that a parts list is not enough. Usually, what follows directly from that. Which goes against your claim that the Genome Project reduced us to a parts list. In fact, just the opposite claim is made routinely these days in the literature. But the second question, that's just a comment. The question is, I'm confused by what we're counting as human nature. Now, some of the discussion refers to the germline, and human nature is what's in the germline. Sometimes we talk about changing human nature by making nanotechnology hybrids, or by with medication, Prozac. But that's not change. I mean, is that? Do we include that under the rubric of changing human nature? Because that's changing the species not in a biological way, but in a cultural. These are environmental interventions.
Fukuyama, which is where I introduced this, invokes Ritalin and Prozac, et cetera, as indicators of where we would go if we could genetically engineer human beings to be different. That we would devise human beings such that they were, as he says, androgynous, conformist, et cetera, judged by how our devotion to the use of these drugs.
It sounds like he's saying we're doing that already.
Well, no, not in the sense that we are changing human nature, because you take people off the drugs and they presumably would revert. But that we would engineer people genetically is what he is concerned about. And how would we engineer them genetically? Well, it would be along the lines so that they would conform to what we seem to want to achieve by the administration of these drugs. That's the point. It's not that he's saying that the human nature is changed by the administration of these drugs. So what he's, his his thesis is fundamentally political, I think, almost blatantly political. It's what I said. I don't want to repeat it. It has to do with his notion of the foundations of liberal democratic capitalism, individualism, et cetera, et cetera. So,
okay, but let me just our experience with mind-altering drugs is very telling. It's very interesting here because it does change our conception of ourselves in a very marked way. I think that's probably had more responsibility for our biological acceptance of ourselves as machines than anything else. And therefore, I think it does raise an ethical question, but I'm struck by the fact that in Europe, it's not included under the bioethical.
that what is not?
The use of the proliferation of behavior-altering drugs.
No, it's really not. It's really remarkable, isn't it? I mean, we make this big distinction between legal drugs and illegal drugs. And we have a war on one, and the other one, we just act like it's fine, like it's medicine.
Right.
Well, he doesn't have to be happy. But I mean, that, you know, we're talking about immediate questions.
He doesn't like
more important one.
use of the drugs or the future engineering to conform to the drugs.
Yeah.
About one thing I like about your talk is that you're taking the issue seriously, that there could be problems coming, and of course I take that seriously too.
Yes. Could be what?
We have
What's the word?
problems coming with these.
Might not all be wonderful in the future.
Other things, whatever, are coming.
Yes, you do.
So I like that a lot. Now we come up with different answers about how to come at it, but that's okay. At least we're talking about it. That's great. So here's a scenario that I'm picturing if we were to try to launch into your solution, and thank you for at least trying to have one, and I appreciate that. I think that there are countries in the world that aren't going to play with this, and they're going to want to go ahead. So I think the scenario that would be very likely to play out is that some countries would sign up for this, and others would not because they want to go ahead, and that rather than have some kind of coherent human effort to deal with this issue, that instead we would immediately split into two armed camps, which I think would be much more likely to cause warfare than this prospect of an improved entity wanting to kill us. So I'm glad you're taking on the problem, and I think we should continue to talk it out and play scenarios out, because I'm really concerned that this particular initial proposal, which thank you for making one, I think it probably needs some more work. But
it needs lots of work.
But
I'm the first to say that.
Let's keep talking, because at least you're taking it seriously, which I think is great.
But right now, as Charles would say, China won't play. Right? China would say, fine. Right? You guys go ahead and do that and outlaw it, and we'll go ahead and do it.
we're here at this conference. We were asked to try to look very far in the future, and you are, and I think that's great. So, but let's keep working on this.
Okay,
I would just call your attention to the case of Germany and genetic engineering. Now, there's been, for several decades, there was a strong objection to genetic engineering. I don't mean human genetic engineering, but microorganismic and so any genetic engineering, not human, because of the overlay of the Holocaust and also because of the Green Movement, et cetera. Now, once biotechnology, however, beginning in the late 80s, began to appear profitable, the Germans decided, even Greens in Germany decided, hey, Germany's got to be part of the future, and we have to embrace genetic engineering. And they have. They have embraced biotechnology in a big way. It's a much different scene there now from what it was, say, in the late 70s, early 80s. I would suggest that if profits are seen to arise from any of these technologies applied to human beings, that there will be strong pressure in states that have decided to ban this stuff, not to go to war against those who are doing it, but simply to change their laws so that they can compete too.
Absolutely. Commercialism is going to be very hard to defeat, yes.
It seems that, like it or not, effective or not, there is a lot of regulation around enhancement or alteration of the human species. And my question is, how do you create regulation that doesn't become rendered obsolete or irrelevant by the advance of the technology that it regulates. And that the problem is particularly evident in the proposal that you just made. You can sort of define various kinds of alterations that could be made on a human, but of course there are infinite number of ways, symbiotic ways you could make new things that are like humans that wouldn't be covered by that under any definition. Is there, I guess my immediate reaction was, well, you can define protections for what you know, the species you have, but it seems like it's almost futile to try to define long-lasting regulation for technologies that you don't know. And I'm wondering, you know, would you reverse what you were talking about if you had to deal with that question?
I mean, that, you know, it's always a problem with regulation, is that it's always done for things that we've seen that we know about. So you have to develop, you have to have a flexible system that could take, you know, that could rapidly change. That's absolutely true. And, you know, the law is like really horrible at that. We're very good at setting basic rules. You can't kill, and no murder, no rape, and all that stuff. But not very good at regulating technology. In fact, we hardly regulate it at all. We have, you know, private regulation through institutional review boards and some basic human experimentation regulation. But that's so far the only way we've been able to pretend that we're regulating new technologies, is by regulating what you can do to other human beings. That's actually part of international human rights law too, believe it or not. Experimentation without consent. In fact, informed consent, as Dan Callahan has said, and I think first when he said it, I thought he was wrong, but now I think he's right, is the only non-controversial contribution that ethics and law has made to the practice of medicine and technology. And I think everybody agrees with informed consent.
But there's some, again, I hate to sound like a broken record here, but you have to introduce real institutional, political, and economic, the real institutional, political, economic environment in which all this is happening. With regard to, say, the possibility of human genetic engineering, let's just look at embryo research. Embryo research is forbidden by the National Institutes of Health under any of its grants, and it's forbidden in any institution which is supported by NIH. The reason for that is the Right to Life movement, particularly the Hyde Amendment. So what is has been the consequence of that? The consequence has been that there is a huge IVF industry which is coupled with embryo research. It's the human embryo research. It's the only place human embryo research is done, is in the private sector. Completely unregulated, except possibly for state laws here and there. There is no prohibition against doing human germline or any kind of other genetic engineering in the private sectors, And so long as our country, and so there's commercial incentive to do it. We can see how the IVF industry operates and so on, with extravagant promises. I don't mean that everybody in IVF is a charlatan, but the Raelians are just an out of space, literally and metaphorically, version of this kind of exploitation. Given this division, at least in this country, happily it's not true, say, in Britain, given the division in this country over that, there's certainly no national oversight or scrutiny of any of these potential experimentations with at least with human beings at the embryo stage. And I think it would be a very tough sell, George, you're the lawyer, so you should comment on this, to try to pass a national law, which, assuming the Right to Life movement would allow such a thing, to have national regulation of embryo research, whether it's involves human genetic engineering or not.
Yeah, now we're back to today. I'm sorry, I keep going back from 200 years in the future to today.
Yeah, that's where I am.
Today, you're absolutely correct. The Right to Life movement rules the federal government, and the federal government can't do anything, and private industry can do whatever it wants. And that's the worst of both worlds. There's absolutely no question about that. At least you'd like everybody on the level playing field and have some rules that everybody followed if you're going to do embryo research. And I'm in favor of embryo research. But yeah, now we have totally unregulated embryo research in the private sector. And we actually don't know what's going on.
That's right. We don't know what's going on.
We just don't know.
I guess I'm one of these people who's never really believed that there's a good argument for prohibiting cloning other than the harm to the potential harm to the child. Right. And I think that's going to be with us for some time.
That's a good enough one, though.
Well, that is a good enough one.
Okay.
But you seem to imply that there was that cloning ought to be banned, and I assume you mean even if we had complete confidence that it wouldn't lead to a higher risk of a deformed child than the ordinary way of reproducing. And I guess I'm going to press you on why you think that that is morally defensible. I mean, I think you mentioned that there's something inherently wrong with producing a human being other than through sexual reproduction. But of course, that argument was raised against artificial insemination in the 1950s and against in vitro fertilization in the early 80s. And now I think most people would agree that the moral problems in either of those techniques is zero. So if other than immediate cause of human suffering, which we would all agree would render an act immoral, and other than the misconceptions that many people have, such as that by cloning you're going to make yourself immortal, you're going to transfer a soul from one person to another, given that to produce a clone is simply to produce a twin of a different generation, what is the argument for criminalizing it above and beyond harm to the child in the procedure itself?
Okay, I mean, I really meant what I said. I know I went through this pretty fast. But my major reason for using cloning is an opportunistic one. It's not that I think cloning is the worst thing in the world. I mean, I would outlaw cloning for the safety reason right now. I mean, who knows what it'd ever be safe. But again, if you believe the scientists, it's unlikely that it could ever be safe. And that's fine enough with me. But my real reason for outlawing cloning is to set a precedent, so we can talk about things like cloning. And my thing I want to talk about is germline genetic engineering. All right? And we've never had a moral agreement on anything in this world. And we do have one on reproductive cloning, even if it's a phony one. Now, maybe you say, well, I shouldn't take phony ones. I should only take pure ones. But you look around in the world, I'll take what I can get. If I can get an agreement on one thing, I'll take it. I'm not going to be too careful. Some people have religious objections to it. Some people have safety objections to it. Some people don't want to commodify children. Some people think it's a crime on the child. I don't think there are any killer arguments on either side, is what I've written.
I'm not a legal scholar, but it strikes me that the argument that there's actually no reason to criminalize something, but everyone wants to criminalize it, therefore
I didn't say no reason. Safety is good enough right now.
But I'm pressing you on the arguments other than the safety reason. So I think we should certainly ban things.
But I don't think we need to go beyond that. I really don't. The scientific literature is pretty clear on that. There's no legitimate scientist in the world that believes we should do human cloning now. You have two illegitimate ones, Zavos and Antonore, who are raving lunatics, in my view.
Oh, I agree, but I don't think you've answered my question. But anyway.
Okay, all right. I mean, yeah.
I'm sensing a difference in the way that you view things. I mean, George, you seem to be very process-oriented in your acceptance or rejection of things, whereas Dan is more similar to myself, which is outcome-oriented in his acceptance or rejection of things. I mean, and this is, we're talking here about human cloning, for example, reproductive cloning, and obviously, you're right, no sane scientist would do it right now for the safety reasons. But you have to separate safety from values, and you seem to have reasons of value to reject it. And Dan has already expressed this, but I want you to express this as well. I mean, the European Union, I forget which document they had. They had a document, some kind of document about preservation of some kind of human rights document in the 1980s, where they said every child has the right to be born without disease, and they also said in the document every child has the right to be born with an unaltered genome. And in some cases, hypothetically, in some cases, those might be contradictory. Where you might, and Dan said he would accept this if you had a particular situation where a family had a history of some serious disease and they wanted to avoid that. Dan would say that was an acceptable version of germline engineering, and you would say it's not, I gather.
Can I just introduce a little point of fact?
Yeah.
What the European Union did was, in the course of its debate around 1989, 1991, on the European Union's Genome Project. It was initially proposed as a project in, quote, preventive medicine, unquote, in which the Genome Project was justified on grounds that this would eliminate disease, that it would reduce the cost of medical care in Europe, make Europe more competitive, et cetera. And a variety of people in the parliament rose up and say, hey, this sounds like a neo-eugenics. We don't want any part of it as such. And so what they did was to enact a genome project that was completely sanitized of any notion of preventive medicine, that this was a good thing to examine, to do research on the human genome and make the information available if necessary and possible for the prevention of disease. But it was the way it was framed and the commitment of the union that was at issue. So they did not, I don't think, contradict themselves at all. Well, in the end.
The human child has the right to an unaltered genome. I remember those words. So in theory, that could be contradictory.
Well, I don't remember that, but maybe we're thinking about two different initiatives, but okay.
I guess what I'd say about that is children don't have a right to be born at all. It's just incoherent to talk about rights of people that don't exist and may never exist, either to be born healthy, or to be born with an unaltered genome. I think we have to decide what we think parents have rights to do and whether there are limits on what parents can do to their children, whether they're embryos and to their fetuses. Once they're children, then we also look at what they can do to their children, to implant and that stuff. But I think it's incoherent to talk about rights when you got embryos and fetuses. Okay.